Herzlich willkommen zu Sei freundlich und lokalisiere. Well, are you confused? Well, you should be. So let's speak English now. So be kind and localize. Well, are you still confused? Well, that's good, that's great, because that's how a user of an application which has not been localized feels like. So you got the feeling, and I think maybe you'll keep that in mind. And first, a quick information about myself. So my name is Joachim. I'm doing plugin development for like 15 years now. And 7 years ago, I became self-employed to offer commercial plugin development services, which includes consulting and also actual development. Well, it's mostly development. And I'm also offering a paid plugin on the JetBrains marketplace, and that plugin is localized. So I do have some experience. But first of all, let me explain what this presentation is about. So I will cover localization of IntelliJ IDEA plugins. So plugins based on the IntelliJ IDEA platform. It's for version 2024.2 and later, which is the current version, and earlier versions, especially 2023.3 and earlier, are much more difficult to localize. Many things have changed in the recent version or the most recent version, and it's much easier now. First of all, there's a distinction or a difference between internationalization, short I-89, and localization, which is L10N. So internationalization is basically the technical implementation to make it possible to translate your user interface, and localization would be the actual translation or the process to make your software suitable for a new language or country. My presentation includes some data, especially about the marketplace, and this data is was last updated early October. So keep that in mind, but I don't think many things changed in the meantime. You can find my slides online and also the sample code. There will be a QR code at the end of this presentation, so you'll can access it with the code. So first of all, what could possibly go wrong? Well, it's usually subtle, not always easy to discover or to find. So what could possibly go wrong? You have your user interface. In this case, it's a bad dialog. So to make it clear that you definitely should not do it like that. It's a dialog wrapper, a usual way to add a dialog to your JetBrains plugin. You've got the functions or methods to provide a label with the current time, a label with the current date, and also a label with the status text. You will see a screenshot on the next slide. And well, it's not too bad. You've got you're using the string format for time formatting and date formatting, which is using the JVM's default locale under the hood. And you also got a status text. It's a very stupid implementation just for demo, and it's demonstrating formatting of numbers, of file sizes, and of a duration. So how does that render in your user interface, assuming that you're a user of American English or any English setup? So that's how it would look like. It's not too bad. It's quite fine, actually. You got a date, you got a time, you got the title case, title of the dialog. You have a status text in the lower left corner, and with the usual formatting of numbers applied. But how would that look like on a different system, assuming that the default locale is not English or American English in this case, and assuming that the user selected language pack of the IDEs to change the language of the interface. So it would look like this. It's a subtle difference, not much to spot. You got a Korean translation of the buttons in the lower right corner, and you got a mix of different formatting styles throughout the dialog. It's still the US-based format of the date in the lower top left corner. It's month, day, year, which is uncommon in other countries. It's the usual time formatting. You got a strange mix of the number formatting and the status text. In this case, it's a system with a German default locale and a Korean language pack, and that's confusing or mixing up things a lot, as you can see. So do not expect that users have the proper setup and that it's always going to look like on your system. You got a few settings in the IDE. You can change the language, which is like English, simplified Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. And there are also plugins or third-party plugins contributing a few language packs. You got a region, but that's not used for the language. Check out the help text below. You also have settings to define the system date and time format. You could apply your own pattern, for example. And there's also a setting for pretty formatting of date and time. Keep that in mind. You will have to use it in your plugin. So the question is what you could localize. So there are a few things you could localize inside your plugin. That's text messages, that's including numbers, date, time, file sizes, whatever you like, or whatever you're going to show. There's a few resources of a plugin, which is usually file templates, inspections, which has a description, for example, intentions, live templates. There are a few more things you could localize. There's also links to help pages. You can add a link, a help button to dialogues to link to an external page. That's what you could do. Outside the plugin, there's more to localize, or more. Outside the plugin, there's more you could localize. This includes your presentation on the JetBrains marketplace. That includes your website, if you have any. In my opinion, you should have one. There's documentation or a manual. There's support, there's sales, there's even more. As you can see, that could become quite complex to fully localize for a certain market or country. So about the supported languages, there's 3 languages officially supported by JetBrains. There's simplified Chinese with the most downloads by far. There's also Japanese and Korean. And keep in mind that these language packs are bundled with the latest releases of the IDE, so the actual downloads will be different or higher right now. The question is, should you localize? You definitely should internationalize, in my opinion. But the question is, should you localize? For example, should you localize for the Chinese market? As you can imagine, localization does not come for free. There are a few questions you could ask yourself. For example, have users ask for a translated user interface? For example, have they asked for a simplified Chinese user interface of your plugin? Do you know anything about the preferred language, for example, based on metrics or telemetry? If you have a paid plugin, do you know anything about the trials from any of these countries, like China for simplified Chinese, for example? Do you get any website visits? If you got a website from these countries, like how many visits do you get from China? Are you a native speaker of one of these languages? Like, do you speak Japanese or South Korean? If you do, I think in my opinion, you definitely should localize or at least add a translation of your user interface. For one, to make sure that you have all covered in your IE18N implementation, and also it's rather cheap to do because you don't have to pay anyone else. So do that if you speak any of these languages. So what are other plugin vendors doing for localization. There's about 7,800 plugins on the marketplace. Only 10% are internationalized and use resource bundles, but only a few plugins are actually ship translations in one of the supported languages, simplified Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. For paid plugins, the numbers are higher. It's about 30% of the paid plugins are using bundles and 10% are translated. So there's definitely different for paid plugins, which is understandable in my opinion, because you would like to reach out for markets or be attractive for the large markets which are not using English as their main language. For paid plugins which are compatible with the latest available version, it's basically the same. There are less plugins which means there are few plugins which are not compatible with the latest version, but it's about the same numbers. And in the second table, you can see which translations are actually shipped with the plugins. It's mostly simplified Chinese, which is more than 90% for all of the sections. And it's between, like, as you can see, between 13 and 17% for Japanese. So there's a drop off. Korean and Japanese are usually the same, as you can see, for the downloads of the language packs and also for the actual translations of third-party plugins. Keep that in mind. I think you definitely should add a localization into simplified Chinese, at least for if you are doing a paid plugin. For paid plugins, there's more data available to make a decision if you should localize or not. For Bash Support Pro, about 19% of all trials are coming from China mainland, and about 10% of these 18% convert to an actual sale. So that's the conversion rate for the trials. It's mostly the same for the other plugins. For Japan, for example, there's only 1% of the trials for Bash Support Pro, but I have to add that Bash Support Pro only is shipping a translation for simplified Chinese. So Japanese is definitely different. And the conversion rate is actually higher in Japan and about the same in Korea, at least for Bash support. So if you have a paid plugin, make sure to look at these numbers for your own plugins. I-89, which is the actual technical implementation of internationalization for your JetBrains plugin. Make sure to read JetBrains' own documentation and definitely do not use or change the JVM's default locale. Make sure to use dynamic bundle get locale instead. That's what you should use. Everything else is going to make a mess. Use I-89 from the very beginning. Doing that later is very time consuming and you will most likely forget a few places. Make sure to use Unicode, of course. Make sure to use Unicode in property files too. And American English is the default language of the IDE and also of the marketplace. So how could you do the messages? Translated messages for your user interface. That's definitely the most common thing to do in plugins. You should instantiate a dynamic bundle, then use get message to get the text for a message key. I usually prefer for Kotlin code an global I-18N function, which is inspired by KDE years or decades ago. Do it however you like, but make sure to use dynamic bundle and the get message method. For messages, there are a few extras you could use because JetBrains is applying Java's message format to the resource bundles. You could use patterns and placeholders. For example, look at the first code snippet. The first line, item selected, contains a placeholder, which is going to be formatted as a number with the integer formatting applied. There's also a choice pattern, the second line, which is a bit complicated to define or to set up. There's also date and time in the message format, but I do not advise to use it because it's not using the IDE settings. I'll explain that later, or I'll expand on that later. If you are using choice patterns, it could be confusing to find which of the conditions applies to a certain value. Just go backwards. At least that's what I found most useful. For example, if you have the value of 2000, you go backwards. The first matching condition is greater than 2, and you will get the generic formatting text. If you have 2 and you go backwards, you will have the condition for just 2 items because it's not matching greater than 2. There's also an ordinal extension added by JetBrains. Look at the example, it's containing third instead of 3. It's fine for English, but it's not fully localized, so it's not providing ordinals for other languages. I hope JetBrains is going to add an implementation for the supported language packs, but currently it's just adding ordinals for English. Up to you if you use it. I currently do not use it. There are a few utility functions for AI18N. For date and time, there's the date format util, which is only localized with the upcoming major version 2024.3. It's not fully working on the current version 2024.2. Look at the 2 methods. If you're okay with the long date format, you could use the second method. If you really need formatted date and time, you'll have to wait for the next version, unfortunately. For durations, it's similar. Just check out the methods I'm listing here. For file sizes, there's currently no method available which is fully localized. It's currently using the JVM's default locale. So it's probably going to create a mix of different formatting styles if you're using the method for formatted file sizes. I just hope that JetBrains is going to fix that with the next versions. There's a lookup order for I18N for internationalized resources. The IDE or the SDK is going to look at different resource paths to find the translated resource in your plugin. You definitely should not reuse resource paths which are also in the SDK because that would make it fail. With the example of messages, my bundle properties, the IDE is looking at the following locations if the user has configured simplified Chinese. So there's some prefix directory with the language name and language region taken from the locale. There's also a suffix to the file and then a more generic lookup with just the language code. I usually prefer 2.2. Up to you what you do. There's also I18N for actions. That's a very common thing to do in your plugin. Make sure to add the ID attribute, and that ID attribute will allow the IDE to automatically look up resources or resource keys from your message bundle. If you are using the override text tag, you could use it, but only specify the place because that will make it look into the resource bundle. In this case, if you use place equals main menu, the second line of the resource bundle snippet is used, which is action, go to action, main menu text. So I usually do that to customize an action for the main menu, for example, and I find that quite useful. That's a bad example. You should not do that. Everything looks all right in this example, but it's using messages actions bundle, which is also present in the SDK. And as I mentioned before, that's going to fail. Even if you have all the proper resources in your plugin, it's going to look into the SDK's actions bundle, and that's not going to work. So don't do that. Make sure to do not use paths which are also in the SDK. For inspections, it's similar. There's a key attribute. You got a group key, group path key to use messages from your resource bundle. And if you're adding highlighting, use I18N or your messages to show the display text for warnings in the editor, for example. There's also a lookup for the resource path for the There's also a file which contains the description of your inspection, and that's loaded from the resource path. Make sure to add translations for this file too. And the generic lookup order applies, just what I explained for resource bundles. For intentions and mod commands, it's similar. Intentions, just override get text and get family name and use your resource bundle for mod command actions, which is going to be the replacement for intention actions. Override get family name and make sure to use I18N in your get presentation implementation. And there's also a few resources loaded by intentions, which means the description and the code template or the code sample for before and after the intention is applied. And make sure to use the description directory name if you're obfuscating your plugin, because by default, the lookup path or directory name is using the class name of your intention, and that's not going to work if you're obfuscating. For file templates, it's very similar. Look at the documentation provided by JetBrains. That's explaining it quite well. It's a template based on your path, and the other is the description, and it's just the generic lookup order. There's live templates you could also localize. You can localize the description with the key attribute. That would add a translation of the label shown in the settings, for example, but you're not able to localize or translate the live template group, and you can also not localize the text you would enter in your editor to get the live template completion. In this example, it's localize, so that's always in English for this example. There's also documentation provided by JetBrains, so look at that. And for configurables in the settings, it's similar. Make sure to use the key attribute because the translation would be loaded from the XML, and it does not require that your application configurable is instantiated. So use the key attribute. You do not have to use the display name or get display name method. Key is enough. There's also searchable options, which is usually added by your Gradle build. And with the latest and current version, it's automatically using your keys of your message bundles. So that's quite nice. It's a quite nice change. So you do not have to care about that. There's also links to help pages, as I mentioned before. In your dialog wrapper, you could override get help ID to show a help button. As soon as there's a help ID available, the help button will be shown in the dialog. To make that work, you have to implement a web help provider. There's a demo implementation below. Just make sure that you have a unique topic or ID prefix, otherwise it's not going to work. And you should link to translated pages of your website. There's the actual presentation on the marketplace. It's English, and the marketplace is not fully localized, unfortunately. So you're limited to what you could do. Make sure to keep your presentation in English. Add translated links And you could also mention the supported language packs. I'm doing that for Bash Support Pro. And there's 2 UTRAC issues you could vote on to get a localized marketplace. Here's an example for Bash support. So in the description shown on the marketplace, there's Chinese for the main links to the website or to the manual. And at the end of the description, there's also a mention of the supported language packs. You could do that similar. I would not use Chinese for more than a few words in the description. There's also your product website and your online help. You should provide a website in English, at least that's my opinion. If possible, provide a manual or help pages, and consider to translate the manual and or your website to make it more appealing to users in China, for example. I did that for Bash support. It's basically using Markdown with Hugo to provide an easy to maintain fast website. I like it because I can use version control for that. I could reuse the Markdown created for my plugin on the website, and I also automated screenshots because it's very time consuming to provide screenshots in different languages. So that could take a lot of time. I'm glad I automated that. And only a few pages are currently translated, so it's not complete. I used Upwork to find a translator. At least that was the only platform I could find to work with Chinese translators. There's also the IntelliJ community Slack. There's a jobs channel, but it's very low traffic. I also mentioned a few known problems. You cannot localize for older versions without a lot of workarounds. I did a blog post about that a few years ago. You can look at that if you like. It's linked in the first bullet point. As I mentioned, the date format UDL is not fully localized, and currently also file sizes and the ordinal extension is also not fully localized. So be careful if you're using that. There are a few tools and links I like for translations or localization. I like DeepL for the quality of the translations. I'm also using WebLate as a self-hosted translation software to work with Chinese translators, for example. I think it's a good fit for small companies or small vendors. There's also a localization software used by JetBrains, at least according to the Git commits in IntelliJ community. And there's also a tool I made for paid plugins to extract some statistics about trial conversion, for example. Make sure to read Java's locale and message format documentation. Especially the message format documentation is helpful to know how to create the patterns for the choice format, for example. There are a few resources provided by JetBrains. There's the approval guidelines. Make sure to read them because you might get into trouble if you're just using Chinese, for example, or any other language which is not English. There's also documentation on internationalization and how to provide translations. It's helpful to read that. And there's also in the miscellaneous section an interview with a JetBrains employee about how JetBrains expanded into China. I found that quite interesting and helpful, even if small vendors, which are the common case for paid plugins, could not do everything what JetBrains did. And there are also insights into top countries in usage and growth in the annual report of the past year. So I think it's useful. So look at that if you like. And thank you very much for listening. I really enjoyed doing this presentation, and to prepare for that, I even learned a few things I was not aware of before. So thank you very much.
Dankeschön. Thank you, Joachim.
Bitte.
Dziękujemy.
Yeah, exactly. For this very thorough and detailed introduction into this topic. I have an anecdote from my personal experience when going to Japan once to hold a talk, and we had live translators there because most of the Japanese developers actually don't understand a single bit of English. So they told me that most of the technical books even get translated to Japanese just for the Japanese market, because apparently the English level, even amongst developers, is not sufficient for most companies. So they really struggle with English UI. And I would think it's somewhat similar in Chinese market, where the English proficiency is also maybe not as high as we would think as an outsider. Good. So we have a couple of questions for you to comment on.
Okay.
What about other languages? Did you see a demand for it, or what's your opinion on that?
Well, other languages than simplified Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. Well, that's difficult to say because I guess languages not supported by the main JetBrains IDE won't work very well. So, for example, if I made a translation into German, let's assume that. So there would be a German plugin in an English IDE without a German language pack. So I think it only makes sense to translate into languages supported by JetBrains, even if there would be demand for that.
Yeah. You mentioned rightfully that there are now some third-party language packs on the marketplace, but probably you should check first how strongly used they are. I don't know. I remember that there's a German language pack, a Russian one, and even a French one, I think. But I don't know how many users actually install them. Yeah. Another tip: there's a resource bundle plugin in IntelliJ IDEA, so you can use that. I think it helps with making sure that all the keys are available in all the resource bundles that you want to support, right? So, and you can see all the keys next to each other and see what translations might be missing or need some work.
Yeah, that's a good point. I usually only use that for like viewing or reading resource bundles, because when I don't do the actual translation into Chinese, I just can check it or browse it. And another developer mentioned that he's using unit tests to make sure that all keys are present in a translated bundle, for example.
Yeah, that's a good idea to have such tests in your plugin as well. Yeah. Yeah, that's also a good point. The Java libraries have many caveats, as we've already learned from you, Joachim. But even seemingly simple things like to lowercase, they don't work the same in all languages, and this can also lead to very strange effects in the UI. Especially if we talk about, for example, sorting entries in the UI and stuff like that. These rules are actually also very much language dependent, so don't think that everything just works like in English. It doesn't. One more question to you, Joachim. Have you tried the JetBrains AI Assistant plugin for translation, or?
No, I haven't used it for translations.
Mm.
I usually personally, I don't usually use AI tooling. Another developer mentioned, I was talking to about localization, that he's using the Copilot, not the OpenAI models, so the larger models, to actually let it make a translation, and then another session to verify a translation if there's any unusual wording in the translation, for example.
You mentioned that you actually hired contractors for the translation. Maybe do you have any idea if you, for example, if you cannot afford to hire someone to do the translation, but you rely on some automated translation, do you have any experience how you test the actual translation? I mean, even the contractors might give you strange results maybe, and how did you go
Yeah.
about testing these things?
Well, that's a good question. I also was a bit worried about maybe someone could insert some text I do not understand, but which doesn't fit the plugin. Well, which a text which does not belong there. So that was what I mentioned about the verification using the AI tooling. So you could paste the translated file or resource bundle into OpenAI, for example, let it verify the verification if there's any unusual wording regarding to the quality of the translation. I usually paste it into DeepL, for example, to see the backwards reverse translation to
Okay.
verify if it's still matching the English input or mostly matching it.
Okay, and that worked well for you then, or?
Well, my Chinese users would have to tell, but I think
Okay.
it's good enough. So
Okay.
I could check the Chinese to English reverse translation, and if that's still the English I expected, I think it's good enough.
Well, you could actually ask AI assistants if there is something suspicious in this file.
Sure, that's possible too. Yeah.
Oh.
Don't do that manually.
I could imagine that one thing is checking the actual translation for correctness, but the other thing is that a lot of texts in the UI are combined, maybe even from several translated message keys, or they are combined because you paste a lot of input parameters into them to format the message with some dynamic data, and that could also influence the correctness of the translation to some degree, like maybe missing pluralization or stuff like that. So I would guess the best test would be to actually run the plugin in the IDE and check if the actual use cases yield good results, right? But that's probably too much to do. Huh?
Well, that's right. But what I usually do is to take Chinese screenshots. So I at least run the IDE with the Chinese language pack when I know where to click when I can't read Chinese. So I do have these Chinese screenshots, so I can look if there's any bad rendering or spacing issues in a dialogue, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
But when I don't understand any Chinese, it's very hard to tell if the number formatting is right or not. So at some point.
Course. Okay, last question for you. How do we test UI in different languages? Do you have some experiences you could share?
Well, that's a good question. I currently do not do any UI testing, but what I mentioned is that I do Chinese screenshots, which uses a self-made robot to capture screenshots in a live IDE. So I do know how the IDE user interface is going to look like in simplified Chinese, for example. Well, I think it's very difficult to make sure that it's looking all right if you do not speak the language. You probably should like let test cases capture screenshots and let a Chinese user review these screenshots. That's what I probably would do if I was more concerned about the quality of the UI. But of course, it's a very time-consuming and difficult or complex topic.
Yeah. Anyway, the SDK docs also mention a number of inspections that we have in the IDE. So there's actually some support by the Java Internationalization and the plugin devkit plugin that will highlight untranslated texts in your plugin code and plugin XML. So if you're curious about how much work you have in front of you, you can just run these inspections and see if you want to follow the great advice that Joachim has shared with us today. Thanks a lot again, Joachim, for joining and
You're welcome.
sharing your real-world experiences and Kavit's very useful.
Thank you.